I'd like to welcome to the stage our first session, Australia Post FinOps Journey to the Cloud, Cost Optimisation with Apptio. And please join me in welcoming Jason. Thank you.
Hey guys, so my name's Logan, this one's Jason. So I'm from Apptio. Hopefully you guys are familiar with us. You're obviously all joining to hear a bit of a session about FinOps today. So before we get started, my clicker's not working. Of course, like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we're meeting on. So I'm not going to do this any justice, but the Ngunnawal people. So we'd like to respect and acknowledge the culture, the contribution they make to the city and the region. Also like to acknowledge and welcome any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are attending today. So cool, we'll jump straight into it. So like I said, my name's Logan, Senior Solutions Consultant with Apptio, primarily focused on the cloudability product, so all about FinOps and that journey. Been with the company just under 5 years, so been living and breathing this for quite a while. So if you have any technical questions, feel free to reach out. We've got a few of the account managers scattered around the room today. If you want to find us for a product demo, we are booth 3 as you walk in to the left. So, cool. Joined by me is Jason Gorringe. So he's the Cloud Services Manager with Australia Post. So he'll be giving a bit of a customer story, how they've gone through their FinOps journey. So the agenda for today. So first of all, we'll be talking about what FinOps is, the FinOps framework. So if you're not familiar with it, we'll give a bit of an overview. I'll then jump into who Apptio as a company is, specifically around Apptio cloudability. I'll then pass over to Jason, so we'll talk about the Australia Post challenges, what they were facing, and what their FinOps journey looked like. And then, of course, we'll open up the room for discussion. However, please, if you do have questions throughout the session, feel free to reach out. The moderators have mics around, so just sort of raise your hand, flag them down, and we're happy to answer any questions as we go. Sorry. Awesome. So I'm sure most of you, we're at an AWS Summit. You're very aware of how rapidly the cloud has been growing over the last, call it, what are we now, 2022. So probably since early 2000s, cloud's been on this massive journey. AWS is what it is today. There's obviously the competitors who I won't name because we're at an AWS event. I'm sure you all know who they are. But it's, moving to the cloud isn't just about, the economies of scale. It's about digital transformation. So one of the main reasons that the executive site migration to the cloud is about business agility. It's not just about cost savings. It's not just about, simplifying use. It's about making your businesses more agile, being able to develop quicker, work in that agile framework, deliver applications more efficiently, so on and so forth. So you'll see a bit of a timeline down the bottom here. And this is something that I always like to talk a little bit about, just due to my role throughout my career. So I started at a company called Emerson Network Power, or Vertiv. So if you've heard of them, they build data centers. And it was always, traditionally you'd have these companies that have, 10, 20 racks in their own offices. You're taking up a lot of footprint, all of that's capital expenditure. So you're sinking a lot of money into building your own on-prem data centers. So with that, we moved into that born in the web companies. So people that were web specific, they started looking for technologies that suit their development methodologies, looking for things where they may not necessarily need that upfront expenditure to build their own data centers. And that's sort of how the cloud was born. So in 2006, that's where Amazon launched EC2, so as you know it today. That's where agile and DevOps methodologies really started coming into play. So now we're at a bit of a tipping point. So as that cloud spend has been rapidly moving up since about 2006, Gartner here estimates that public cloud spend is going to be about $661 billion worldwide by 2025. and it's only going up. So more and more companies are migrating to the cloud, and with that comes a bunch of challenges about how do you manage that spend, how do you do it efficiently, and how do you make sure that you're not getting bill shock, cost anomalies, etc. So, like I started talking about, a couple of challenges of cloud financial management. So the first one is indefensible migration plans. So as you're moving from CapEx to OpEx and trying to marry those fixed and variable costs across your cloud ecosystem, those complex challenges are really brought about by cloud that can hinder that organization's ability to truly maximize that value. Without the ability to connect those on-prem and cloud costs and build defensible migration plans, those cloud migrations themselves are at serious risk of cost overrun, operal disruption, and at worst, failure. So you could go and sink all this money into moving out of your data centers, trying to do a lift and shift or re-architecture into your cloud platform. There's a high potential for failure if you haven't built out those defensible migration plans. Next big challenge is unestablished internal practices. So as you start to migrate to the cloud, if you're just simply doing a lift and shift and thinking that a one-to-one comparison is going to net you the best results, this is where you're really going to start to struggle unless you start building those guardrails in place from the get-go. And this is something we see quite a lot today. And this is sort of where FinOps was built around. So trying to put those guardrails in place, trying to help customers build those internal practices so when they do migrate to the cloud, they're not faced with this bill shock, those cost overruns, and they're able to accurately allocate those costs and help, whether you're doing showback or chargeback, help recover those costs themselves. And of course, limited and disjointed visibility. So this is something that really comes into play as your cloud environment starts to get more and more complex. So sure, if you're 20K a month on AWS, you may only have a couple of linked accounts. It's quite easy to manage, but as customers are spending more and more, their account hierarchies get more and more complex, and that spend becomes a lot harder to manage. You might be trying to pass that visibility down to teams to help enable that team ownership, or you might have your financial teams trying to help recover costs or drive that charge back to your internal business units. So unifying that spend, it's not just about your cloud, it's about that full cloud ecosystem. It's inclusive of SaaS costs, inclusive of on-prem costs where applicable, but having that ability to normalize and manage that variety of costs to make sure those investments are being made and savings can be realized for future investment into new projects. One of the key benefits of having those cost savings, freeing up that OpEx, making sure teams are running as lean as possible. So rather than having this amount of spend that you're using for your cloud projects, you're freeing up that additional OpEx so you can start to reinvest that into additional projects, whether it be headcount, whether it be funding projects as a whole. Oops, sorry, wrong button. So this is a fantastic stat from Gartner. So throughout 2022, in any given month of the year, over 30% of the growing expenditure of software and cloud services will be unused. So you can think about the amount of money that's being left on the table. So there's lots of fantastic reports about this from the likes of a Gartner, a Forrester, et cetera. This isn't just something that Apptio is doing as a sales pitch. FinOps as a whole has this entire discipline. If you haven't read the FinOps book, definitely check that out. But there's also the FinOps Foundation that you're able to join for free. There's lots of community engagement there. Definitely great resources. So whether you're using a tool like Apptio Cloudability, or you're trying to do this in spreadsheets, you're trying to do this through AWS Cost Explorer, getting into the mindset of how do we save money, how do we optimize our cloud spend, definitely that great mentality to get into. So talking about FinOps itself, so it's a sustainable end-to-end process. It's really more about, how do we create this life cycle of cost independence for our end users. So like I mentioned, vendor agnostic, tool agnostic. FinOps itself is a discipline, much like DevOps, DevSecOps, any of these fancy names that people come up with. One thing that I always like to mention, FinOps itself isn't financial operations. It's a very common misconception, and it's not just a finance lens. It's more about how do we enable DevOps teams and finance to talk a similar language. So there's always been a bit of a disconnect between developers and finance, specifically with the new procurement models around cloud. So I'm sure, for anyone who's been around for quite a while, the traditional procurement method was always you'd raise a PO, buy a couple of hypervisors, they'd sit in your data center. That's CapEx that you don't really have to worry about because that's sunk costs. Today, your developers, your teams basically have an account. They've got free reign on what they can spin up, how they utilize it. And of course, if you're not aware of what you're spending, how you're being elastic with it, you've got a massive chance of overrun. So as we jump into FinOps, you'll see that it's broken down into 3 phases. So the first is inform, and this is really about how do we provide those individual teams, business units, or the organization as a whole, visibility into their cloud spend. So of course you have your tools like AWS Cost Explorer, but like I mentioned before, as you start to get a bit more mature in your cloud practices, you're potentially using multiple cloud vendors, having this single pane of glass, being able to give these teams and give them visibility and allow them to take ownership of their own cloud spend. So the idea behind this is you want to be able to allocate 100% of your cloud costs, knowing where every dollar is. And this is really important when you're looking at things like shared costs. So whether it might be untaggable spend, service charges, taxes, knowing how you want to allocate that. If you're purchasing RIs or savings plans, how you amortize that across the actual consumers. So the next is how do we optimize that spend? So now that we have full visibility into where our spend is going, how do we make sure we get the best bang for buck from those dollars that are being spent? And optimization is always an interesting one, because when you think about optimization, you might think about right sizing, you might think about reserved instance planning, savings plans, etc. And of course, those are very key elements. But optimization as a whole isn't just about identifying where you may have cost overrun. It's about identifying the processes behind that in the first place that are causing that cost overrun. So if you start looking at the actual underlying issues, where you might have templates, you're seeing patterns that are saying you've got a whole bunch of, call it T2 4x larges, and you've got recommendations to migrate those all to a T2x large, you might start asking the reasons, why do we keep seeing these recommendations pop up time and time again? Rather than having that as a point-in-time exercise to go through each one of those recommendations, we see customers who have hundreds and hundreds of pages worth of recommendations of the same type. So looking at the processes that drive that and saying, is there something we can do? Are we using a standard template that's choosing this instance type, and can we scale that? So while you may get a couple of $100 savings per month for each of those resources, if you can nip it in the bud before it even happens, that's that cost avoidance. It's not just cost optimization. Of course, how do you utilize savings plans and RIs, spot instances, making sure that when you do have your static workloads, they're running as cost efficiently as possible, ensuring your best rates. And then, of course, improving efficiency. So this comes under that operate phase of FinOps. So this is really about how, as a business, you can operationalize your processes. How do you enable this ownership back to your teams? How do you put processes in place that are going to make sure that if you're doing this on a monthly, weekly, daily cadence, you have your teams being aware of the spend that they're looking at, what they need to do to help optimize it and run these processes. One of the things that we like to talk about is unless you're using FinOps and you're measuring your teams based on KPIs around FinOps, essentially until heads start rolling, people aren't necessarily going to care about this too much. So building these type of KPIs and building these processes into job descriptions and holding people accountable for it is really going to help build those operational processes. Sorry, wrong button. So I'll give a quick overview about Apptio as a whole, and I'll talk about cloudability, which I'm here specifically today to talk about. So Apptio itself has been around since about 2006, and we've traditionally been in the IT financial management space. So, looking at that executive top-down summary, how do we make IT leaders, or how do we enable them run their IT practice like a business? IT has always been this black box of spend. How do we do, cost TCOs that include things like labor, fully burden costs of applications, getting that full visibility. FinOps itself is a discipline within inside TBM. And this is really about, again, those three phases: inform, optimize, and operate. And this is more of a bottom-down approach. So starting at the bottom, ingesting those cloud bills. So these are going to be from your cloud providers, your AWS cost and usage reports. If you've got a complex environment, I'm sure you're familiar with those. They can be millions or billions of lines long, different types of unit charges, whatever it is. They get incredibly complex. So ingesting those, normalizing the data, and help you visualize where your spend's going. Marrying that with your cloud usage data. So things like your AWS CloudWatch, or if you're using APM tools, Datadog and New Relic are AWS partners, bringing in those utilization metrics so we can really understand what your applications are doing on a day-to-day basis and help build recommendations about that. And then, of course, integrating with some of those third-party tools. So I already spoke about Datadog and New Relic from an APM perspective, but doing alerting through PagerDuty so you can be proactive, or doing integrations with Jira, so when we do get these recommendations, we can create those automatic workflows that are going to pass it on to the right team so they can go and build these practices. So I'll pass over to Jason. So he's going to be talking about how they've built out a FinOps practice at Australia Post, a few of the challenges, and I'm sure he's going to be very open to questions here. Awesome, thank you.
Thanks, Logan. Can everyone hear me okay? Good? Cool. Just want to ask a quick question of everyone. How many people here are in the developer sort of side of things? Developers, cool. Management, finance, one, two.
Wow.
Yeah, so that's awesome. So it's good that we're getting this buy-in, because that's this basically the FinOps role that Logan's been talking about is all about bringing those groups together, management, finance, technology, to talk the same language. And I heard him talking about that same language. It is a completely different language, because I did that role for some time. And when you talk about CapEx and OpEx or journaling to a technology person, it's very different. And then you're talking about cloud native services, like EC2. Most finance people don't know what an EC2 is, and CloudWatch and CloudTrail, all those other services. So you really need to understand that and be that interpreter in that center. And then obviously management want to see cost savings all the time. Tell me you're going to reduce the bill, it's too much, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's a really pivotal point. There's FinOps needs to have that good communication skills with everyone. So we faced a few challenges when I started in FinOps. The bill was going up. We didn't know why, so there wasn't that real good visibility. We went from the early cost and usage report into that proper Cur file, so we couldn't download it into a spreadsheet anymore. We had to actually find a tool that helped us do it. So I've seen people do it with QuickSight nowadays, but back when we started, that wasn't even available. So we had that, and unable to predict costs. Budgeting was difficult, especially we were living in a big shared environment where there was 3 dev test prod accounts. Everyone was jumping in, piling in, building stuff, and we didn't know who was doing what. So we came up with these goals to try and control the costs first, so make sure that we don't spend. We wanted to try and flatten those costs, which we were able to do. We needed a centralized billing tool, because unfortunately we don't want to give people access to our master account to actually check the cost explorer at that stage. So it was very difficult in that respect. We wanted to have good cloud governance, so we were using the cloud and that comes to almost like an architectural decision, so that we get good visibility of what services are being used and making sure that they're being used in the right way. We wanted to restore trust between IT and finance as well. So then we can make informed decisions as we go forward into the next phase. So we basically started off, like I said, with the communication. So I want to use this flashy thing. There you go. Cool. So the constant two-way communication between finance, technology, and having that person in the middle was really important. And then that sort of flowed up the management chain and allowed us to sort of get that cost management happening. Education. So education is really important, obviously. And it's education to the finance departments to say, we're actually operating on a OPEX model now, not a CAPEX model. So that was a big change from buying tin to actually moving it to, paying it like your phone bill kind of thing. Then we wanted to also empower people to make the right decisions. And that's probably one of the key ones there, is that unless they can see their costs, they have the visibility and the understanding of how to control their costs as a technology group, then you're very, you sort of, I won't say that, but you're bashing your head against a brick wall, unfortunately. So it's really important that cycle keeps happening. So what I did at Australia Post is built out basically 4 pillars of our FinOps strategy. So the first one, obviously, cost allocation. So the main thing of that, the first thing we did beyond anything was tagging. Get a tagging strategy, tagging standards. Unfortunately, it's really hard to enforce those, but it was really good because we did onboard other cloud vendors. Like I said, we won't mention them here, but at least we had these strategies there when they were onboarded, so that the tagging or labeling or whatever they call it was consistent across that. And we're actually even able to do that back to on-prem, so we can easily find those costs. And once that tagging's in place, you can also start to see who's doing what, and then we can look at where we're going to send those bills and that show back. Policies and standards, as I said, having a service catalogue. So we've built out a service catalogue. We're building it out continually so that catalogue sort of guides people into using the correct tools when they're there, rather than just getting a free-for-all and spinning up massive Redshift clusters and stuff like that. So having that catalogue is really important. One of the big things we also started to do, which actually has changed our cloud environment completely, is multi-account. So the thing with multi-account, like I said at the start, we had big dev, test, prod accounts, and everyone was sharing those accounts. So it was really hard to find, especially if someone didn't tag it and we weren't enforcing tagging, then you couldn't know who spent it. So what we've done now is we've moved to a multi-account architecture where a particular team or a particular application get their own dev, test, prod environment, build, and whatever else they need. And we've built a baseline into that. So all your guardrails, security controls, access controls, network controls are all built into that consistently across every AWS account. So that's one thing that took us that was a longer part of the journey, but it was really important for us, because now if they don't tag it, it doesn't matter, because we're just going to charge it to that account. It's similar to other things, and I will like mention with Google or something, they have a project structure, and everyone in that project can only talk to that project, rather than AWS, which they're changing with organisations, obviously, but they've got individual accounts that are standalone. So it was really important to get that multi-account, but also to get the controls in with multi-account. So the next thing was cost avoidance. We had some really good wins with that. So auto-scaling groups, obviously, S3 archiving, just knowing those products and knowing the tools that you're using is really important. That's probably one of the most important things. We've had a recent, and my TAM keeps hassling me, ringing me up every second day, he's pain in my backside. No, I love it, because he tells me, oh, you're spending too much on CloudWatch. So also, not just knowing the products, but also having the relationship with your AWS team to be able to help you work through that. So that's a really big win for us when we finally do it. And using native services, Resource Scheduler, we introduced Resource Scheduler as a catalog product for our group, meaning that people just have to put in a tag and it automatically turn stuff off. And that's where probably your biggest savings is, as we know. Maybe we don't, but you sort of hierarchy of cost savings, because everyone goes, oh, I want a savings plan or a reserved instance. That's the last thing you do. Like, you do all these other things first. So you right size, schedule your resource, then you worry about maybe buying a reserved instance. Because if I buy a reserved instance and then it needs to be right sized, I'm stuck into that commitment. So just remember that hierarchy of what and when is very important. I didn't put that up there, unfortunately. Recently, like I said, we've got scheduling there, right sizing, reserved instances. So that's the accountability is important where they sit. So as a FinOps person, I'm not going to turn off or right size someone's EC2. So if I do, I'm going to break something, right? So for these ones here, scheduling, right sizing, we can assist, we're inform and talk to the developers, but it's up to them to actually take the action on those things. Whereas reserved instance savings plan is more focused on the actual FinOps central governance group. And obviously using spot instances is another thing that we're working with our team to bring in a spot policy, but it depends on the use cases and where we're sort of working.
So just to jump in there, you made a really good point about the actual way that you plan accordingly for that cost accountability. If you just jump in, start right sizing, start affecting potentially prod dev environments without actually consulting the teams that are using them, chances are you're going to get people yelling at you on Monday morning if you've turned their instances off. So making sure that you can communicate efficiently with those teams, and that's going to be by identifying who's actually using those resources. So that's where things like your tagging policies really come into play. So making sure that you're understanding who's using them. So as a FinOps consultant, you're not actually going and you're not actioning these recommendations yourself, but you've got you can hold the teams accountable for them, make sure that they are using everything as efficiently as possible.
Yeah, 100%. And that's why I saw Jira there. We haven't really used that, but it'd be awesome if we can create a card in somebody's, in a team's backlog based on the fact that they should be right sizing or, putting a schedule on his test environment. So something maybe for us in the next part of our journey to look at. So the final thing is cost transparency, and this is where the managers love it. They get to see, how much we're controlling the costs, not going up, are we, we're turning things off and doing the right thing. Also, it gives them the opportunity to do budgeting better, and that's one of the things where in our next part of our journey we're going to be looking at more analysis, trending and budgeting as we're looking at more of a migration out of data centers and into the cloud, so it's going to be more spend going in there. So we want to make sure that we're sort of got visibility of that spend and we don't get bill shock. The other thing, we were lucky we started off very early in the cloud was we had chargeback. So the chargeback is obviously where you user pays, and it's very good at driving good behaviour because it eventually does flow down. So your manager's going to be telling you to spend money better, and they're going to get pressure from their managers as bills go up. So it's really important we have that communication, and we do those monitoring, reporting, trending, and using the collaboration and communication tools. One thing I will say too, one of the reasons we went with Cloudability, Apptio, was very much the whole moving to multi-cloud. That doesn't mean when we go multi-cloud we say, we want to have, I hate cloud brokerage as a term, it should never be used because it's not a good thing. So when we say multi-cloud, it means we've got specific cloud for specific workloads and specific uses. We're not going to say, hey, I want to turn off in AWS here and turn on in Azure here. It just doesn't work that way. So it's really important though to have that one thing. So a team could be using 3 different clouds and getting a visibility of their whole spend. And unfortunately, native cloud services do not offer that, and that's why a billing tool, especially as you are moving out to that, is good. Ideally, we would have Apptio as well and be getting the on-prem costs as well, but that's a story for another day. So I think that was it that we sort of were talking about. I wanted to make sure that people ask lots of questions, please. So happy to take them for either Logan or myself.
Yeah. So I guess, question from me for the audience: is anyone here actively running a FinOps, FinOps process internally, or is it something you're considering? Any feedback from the room there? Yep.
Nobody?
Not for the FinOps particularly. We're on a journey like you guys, but I have a different question when you're ready.
I think the light's behind you, but is that Craig?
Yeah.
Hi, mate.
Hey.
Very aware of what you're doing today. So. Cool.
So what was the question?
So it's a different question. So with your using this tool now, you say you've been doing it for 18 months or so you're well down your journey, you got your tagging standards set up and you're looking at the bills. My question becomes, using this now, how is your forecasting going? How far do you forecast your budgets into the future for those sort of activities? And then how often do you reforecast and how close are they?
Well, unfortunately, I probably can't really answer that very well because we're not really using that forecasting as well as we should. So we're kind of doing it manually, which is not ideal. So we want to look at, that's the next part of our, big part of our journey, because we are able to use cloud ability to do, especially when we're tagging, we do tag mapping as well. So you can say this cost code tag equals this department. So we've set that up. Now what we need to do is go, okay, what are those departments doing, and because forecasting also involves projects coming along. So we're kind of doing that manually at the moment, which is not ideal. But I'd love to have that cloud ability dashboard do that for us, which is probably the next part for us.
Okay, thanks. Anyone?
Don't be shy. There we go.
Yep. In the middle.
What are the kind of things that you do actually for cost avoidance in the search zone that you're talking about? Obviously, projects will keep coming along, and the requirements are there are developers and cloud engineers all along. And those guys are always spinning things, and that's some of the things that you said, right? You need to start tapping at that point. So what can be done at that stage? It's almost like reactive, right? So you've done the tagging, yes, that's after the machine's been spun up. You're looking at cost and utilization report, that's always after the event has happened. So the predictive analysis and forecasting and actually stopping at the onset, how do you do that?
Yeah, so to stop cost avoidance more comes into when we're doing, when we're building our projects and stuff like that, we look at the best practice. So I'm not FinOps anymore, I'm more of the managing the clouds team as a whole, and we have a lot of insight into, and I think that's why FinOps should be part of your cloud services team. Not, there's always the debate, should it sit in finance, should it sit in here? It needs to be part of your central governance team because it is a central governance function, no different to security or logging or anything like that. So having that gate to come in to use the cloud, that's where we do a lot of the cost avoidance. So we've got a project at the moment and it's doing my head in because these guys want the biggest server they can get and the current workload that they've got is not even using half of it. So we need to be the gatekeeper for that to say, no, just because the vendor says it needs to be this, you're not using that, so why waste your money?
But then that goes against your principle of cost accountability, right? Because at the end of the day, if you want to go spin up a bigger workload, you pay for it. That goes towards the accountability piece of it. 100%. So they are conflicting activities. And the other part, or other challenge on that part as well, is it going away from the principles of DevOps, where you give control to the individual to spin up and spin down automatically, and the one team has got the capability inside the guardrails of cost management being part and parcel of the DevOps practice. So it's sort of competing, you know what I mean? So looking at the 4 pillars, on its own right, they're really nice. Gelling it together, what's been your experience?
No, so with the accountability, even though the accountability sits with the team, we're all one team, right? So yes, they're accountable for their charge, but I'm accountable as you know, or our FinOps practice is accountable to actually help them and educate them. So part of that education process is to actually say, well, you guys don't need this, why are you doing this? So the question why, I'm not going to say, if they want it, at the end of the day, they have it, but we're here to guide them in the right direction. So it's not like it's hard and fast, it's working with them. The other thing, you're right, we want to put it more into the DevOps hands. Unfortunately, we have a traditional IT and we have a digital, our product engineering group. This is sitting in the digital IT. They're not. This is sitting in the traditional IT group. They're not DevOps. So we have a very different relationship. As like a central team, we sort of talk to both these guys. So we have a very different relationship with the DevOps guys. Because DevOps guys are actually using. They're more cloud savvy and smarter. And most of our IT teams are doing data center in the cloud, which is not how we want to do. So we're going through a transformation in the IT side to actually teach them DevOps, and we've got one of the other parts, like I said, you've got security, access controls, logging, cost management. One of the other things is education and culture, and that's one thing we're trying to push as well at the moment.
So just a comment from me. I think cost avoidance is always a very interesting topic. Obviously, when we talk about optimization, it really breaks down into those two sections of actual cost optimization, which comes from your right sizing, it comes from your reserved instances, savings plans. And that's incredibly easy to put a number on when you're talking about how much you've saved. Because you can say, at the year one, we were spending $1 million, year two, we were spending 800K. So, we've really saved 200K over that time. Cost avoidance itself, if you're building those processes to change what you're doing fundamentally, so doing your service catalogs, defining what type of services you should be using, that makes it a lot harder to put a number on what you've saved because that money hasn't been spent in the first place. So ultimately your budgets or your forecasts will be lower, but there's more money for you to reinvest because it hasn't been spent initially and then cut down. You may just have year one where it's only cost you that 800K from the get-go. So it's a lot harder to, like I said, represent what you've saved or what you've avoided, but ultimately it frees up a lot more money that you can reinvest into projects, and you can start to gamify it a little bit. So by doing things like internal benchmarking to see what teams have the best elasticity scores, what teams have the best pricing scores, who's doing things well, and essentially help your individual teams learn from each other so you can make sure you're putting a score against it and say, we're actually doing this whole cloud thing pretty effectively. So we can dive into that in incredible detail. But yeah, definitely recommend checking out the FinOps Foundation. There's lots of stuff in cost avoidance there. So.
And we're also doing things like a recent thing we did was looking at SSM instead of deploying jump hosts all the time. So now when a team comes to us and, I need this jump host, guys, just use this. We've installed the agents, so we're actually avoiding the cost of EC2 by installing agents and the capability to use the native tools.
All right, so according to this little screen in front of us,
30 seconds.
We're running out of time. So any final questions before we wrap up?
Happy to talk to you out on
happy
the
to
floor
talk to you out at the booths, find us around.
Yeah.
But awesome. Thank you all for your attendance today. Hope you've, great.